Hey everyone, welcome to a new episode of In Depth. Ever since I started this project, or started this kind of series, I've wanted to have the opportunity to talk about games in a critical way, or talk about games not in just a silo of game review, but to talk about games and how they situate themselves in today's society, in society's fabric, in everyday life. And one of the things I've noticed in some games recently, particularly in the non-AAA space, is the theme and the messaging around mental health. Mental health is an issue that I think plagues almost everyone. I know in Canada, 1 in every 2 Canadians will have experienced mental health or will have a mental health illness by the time they reach the age of 40. It's important. It affects us all, indirectly or directly. And so I wanted to talk about video games and mental health to see if we can explore what exactly is going on in the video game space. And there's 2 games I wanted to talk about in particular. That's Hellblade's Senua Sacrifice and Celeste, and what they say about mental health and why it's important to us.
When I was a teenager, people really didn't talk about mental health. And I was even more ignorant or oblivious to any conversation going on because I was in the Great White North, too busy immersed in the role of Commander Shepard. I was caught up in intergalactic politics and fighting the Geth. I was too busy trying to save the galaxy. But Mass Effect was one of my favorite games growing up, and it still is one of my favorite games. And these games are important to me because they're some of the first titles I felt like I had to go out into the online world and profess my love for them. I cared about Mass Effect, and I cared about Commander Shepard. And I'm starting my conversation here, or our conversation here, because when I played Mass Effect 3, I think I started to notice something. There's all kinds of theories about the hallucinations that Shepard faces in the final act of the Mass Effect trilogy. But one of these perspectives I often thought about was the mental health of the commander, and how much distress he must have gone through. Some people say that Commander Shepard was a broken hero, filled with trauma and stress, and probably PTSD. But all of this is discussed kind of in the final hour of the game context, in that ending. But sometimes I thought, maybe Shepard's broken from the beginning of Mass Effect 3, and the hallucinations are all induced by the psychological trauma from the first 2 games. Maybe. Regardless, I started becoming more aware of the presence of mental health, and games like Spec Ops The Line and To the Moon furthered, I think, some kind of mental health consciousness in gaming. Then, last winter, I booted up Hellblade Senua Sacrifice. I knew within moments, when hearing the voices in my headphones as Senua paddled down the river, that Hellblade was special. That it was going to be more than I think just a game. That although there's been many other titles that have dealt with trauma and loss and mental health, that Senua's journey and her psychosis was going to be unique to her own. And a year later, when I started my climb of Mount Celeste, and Madeline very early on calls her mom on the phone, and then her mom talks to her about Madeline's panic attacks, it caught me off guard. I had another kind of like, oh, moment. Just like when I heard more than one voice speak in Senua's head. When have you heard a main character in a video game talk about panic attacks? Like, not experience it, talk about it, have a conversation about it? I can't think of any. So I knew Madeline's journey, while burdened with her own issues, was going to speak to something just like that Pictish warriors had a year prior.
Both games, Hellblade and Celeste, their imagery is evocative of the Greek myth of King Sisyphus, who, for his punishment for trying to trick the gods, is tasked with rolling a boulder up a hill, but it will never reach the top, and so King Sisyphus, till the end of time, has to try to do an impossible task. And it's no mistake that both Madeline and Senua have to climb mountains of their own. In Madeline's case, it's quite literal, and in Senua, she's trying to get to the place of Hela, to rescue what she thinks is her loved one.
The climb of the mountain and the Sisyphean task of the protagonist aren't the only similarities between Hellblade and Celeste. There's also the darkness. In Hellblade's, Senua's darkness is both a thing and a person simultaneously until we realize how the voice is the voice of her father. In Celeste, the darkness is represented by that part of the Madeline character. In both stories, the role of the darkness changes and grows. It starts out as something that both protagonists fear, both of them feel burdened with. There's a stigma attached to them. It isolates them. It's something frustrating, impossible to deal with, just like Sisyphus' boulder. Senua thinks her darkness makes her beyond salvation, which is why she risks everything to save Dillion. Madeline thinks the only way she can conquer the mountain, initially, is to have this Frodo-Sam confrontation with a part of her and say, "I don't need you," kind of moment. It's fascinating because the darkness goes from something ominous to something that haunts them, chases them, torments them, but transforms into something totally different once we uncover the truth. The darkness, in Senua's case, is all the trauma inflicted on her by her father, the death of her mother, being locked up, being told her voices are a curse, being ostracized by society, and ultimately being told Dillion's death is Senua's fault. The player and Senua thinks that the darkness should be one of the voices that she hears early on in the game, but we learn that the voices linked to Senua's actual psychosis are only the Furies, that the darkness is actually her father and her father's legacy and her father's curse on her. With Madeline, I think the most beautiful way to depict the evolution of the darkness and the dark parts of her is the mirroring of the two chases. Yeah, there's two chases in Celeste. Early on, when Madeline fears her darkness, part of Madeline chases you through the level. But when things change and Madeline realizes that she actually needs that part of her, she then chases Madeline through those levels. It's something I didn't really actually think about until after the fact, but yeah, even though your target is stationary, you're chasing this part of Madeline until you trap her, until you corner her, and then apologize. In both cases, the darkness represents, I think, how we think about mental health. Of course, we think that it starts out as something dark, as a burden, as something that chases or haunts us. This isolates our characters, and we almost think this isolation is both how mental illness is and what it should be. But maybe that's not the case. Maybe it's not an illness. Maybe that's our false perceptions and our stigma and our misunderstanding.
What's great about both of these titles, both Celeste and Hellblade, is how mental health both informs the narrative of the game as well as the game itself. In Celeste, Madeline literally changes hair color when she dashes. She has a conflict of identity, of personality, of who she is and what she wants to be. In addition, all of the levels in Celeste are actually inspired by Madeline's anxiety. The chase, Mr. Oshiro transforming, the situation that Theo gets in, the fall, all of these derive from who Madeline is and her mental health problems. The whole game is her mental health and her discomfort personified. And what makes it even more beautiful is how the pinnacle of the game is about her realization and her uncovering her truth. A lot of this is the same in Hellblade. Hellblade is particularly brilliant, in my opinion, because every step of the game is kind of informed by Senua's psychosis. To perceive things differently, to look for things in the world, to unlock puzzles, to venture deeper into Helheim. You might just think, is a gameplay gimmick, but it's in fact directly how some people with mental health perceive the world, how they perceive things differently. And when Senua slows down time in combat, she's almost inhabiting a different reality, or maybe her enemies are inhabiting a different reality. And the permadeath thing, I probably could talk for much more time about the significance of the permadeath and the darkness and how darkness manifests at her fingertips, and it's going to crawl all the way up her arm and reach her head. As a player, you think that this is true. You think that if you mess up too many times, Senua is going to die and she's not going to be able to get a second chance. This is just like how some people feel like with mental health, that there is no light at the end of the tunnel. And as it turns out, the developers lied to you. You can mess up 200 times. You can restart 200 times. And you're not going to be forced back to the beginning of the game. But you don't know that in the moment. Your fear becomes Senua's fear. Your anxiety becomes Senua's anxiety. And this is a brilliant way to connect the protagonist who's so deeply flawed with a gamer, and to make a gamer realize what it could potentially be like to live with a mental health illness.
How the gameplay and narrative of both Hellblade and Celeste really coalesce is the feel of how they play. This might just be me, or maybe I'm really starting to get way too deep in the layers of these games, but there's these little gameplay touches that tie everything together. In Hellblade, everything has a weight. You move slow. Your footsteps are heavy. The way you heave into doors to open them, the way the Norsemen take slow steps out of the fog as you turn to confront them. In combat, this weight is on full display. The powerful, deliberate strikes of both Senua and her enemies. When you get struck, you stagger, you fall back, you hit the ground. There's a heaviness. We might think that the heaviness of this title is left to the cutscenes and the monologues and the harrowing conversations, but how the game actually plays feels weighty too. There's this resistance that we feel like we're constantly pushing against around everything Senua does. In Celeste, you might just think we're playing another platformer, so things of course have to be quick and flighty, but that is also who Madeline is. She's nervous, she's anxious, of course she can't hang onto the ledge forever. The very thought of staying still makes her a nervous wreck, and the player too feels the panic of having to move more quickly. The panic and anxiety of trying to master a series of jumps, ledge grabs, and dashes is meant to symbolize and demonstrate Madeline's panic and anxiety of climbing the mountain. And see, when thinking and reflecting for this video, I think this is when everything started to come together. On almost every level, narrative, gameplay, design, tone, atmosphere, music, do these games convey messages about mental health, and positive messages too. The journeys of Senua and Madeline are layered experiences that do everything they can to make the player immersed, to make them connect, and to simulate on some level some kind of experience for the player about what it might be like to walk in the shoes of Madeline and Senua. So when we reach the final chapters of each of their journeys, the most powerful moments to me come from these small spaces in the game. When Senua reaches the Hall of Hela, many turn to the music as a shift in the narrative, when our warrior now displays the true extent of her confidence and strength. But for me, the shift came when one of the Furies said, "Behind you," when a Norseman was about to strike at your blind spot. These same voices have tormented you for most of the game, and now they're helping you. They're on your side. And that speaks to the arc of Senua's story. Senua's Furies are not evil or a curse or a burden, but she had to make the journey through Helheim to learn this. So when she arrives at the understanding in the final battle, the Furies are not her enemy because she knows their torment stemmed from her belief that they were something to be afraid of. And that was deeply rooted in her father's isolation and abuse, and what happened to her mother, what happened to Dillian, and all of this false construction about what Senua is supposed to believe about the voices that she hears, rather than the truth of it. When Madeline begins the final push of her ascent, what encouraged me to keep going, what reassured me and gave me comfort, are these spots where part of Madeline emerges. Madeline and part of Madeline catch each other, almost embrace, and then you get flung high into the air to the next stage. For almost the entire game, you were trying to push this part of Madeline away, and now she's what launches you up higher to reach your goal.
And so the more that I've reflected on these two titles, the more I've realized that it's not a game about climbing a mountain, or it's not about a game going into Helheim and beating up some Vikings. In Madeline's case, it's about finding purpose, accomplishment, achievement, and realizing that she doesn't have to expunge a part of her in order to do those things. In fact, that she actually needs to accept these parts of her. She doesn't have to succumb to the stigma that society puts on her, that she can embrace Madeline. She doesn't have to fight her and conquer her. And it's actually only when she realizes that she needs that part of her, she needs to be whole and true to herself, that she's able to climb the mountain. And in Senua's case, it's not her about rescuing Dillion. It's not even her about finding redemption or atonement. It's about her realizing that the darkness, that everything that she's been told to by her father is a lie. And she can rely on herself, and she doesn't need to doubt. She doesn't need to have regret. And in fact, it wasn't her fault that Dillion died. It was her village's fault for pushing her away, for making her feel less than what she actually is. And it's in the closing moments of the game that she comes to truth with who she is. And she realizes now that her journey is not over, that she doesn't need to die to save Dillion. In fact, and that she can keep on living exactly how she is.
Hellblade and Celeste are rich and satisfying games, and there are still so many layers we haven't unraveled when it comes to the journeys of the protagonists. Like Senua's father and his religious extremism, and Theo's insistence on taking selfies, and the parallels to the Greek mythological figure of Orpheus, and why we hear so much about Alex. Or even, really, the whole conversation if the events of these games actually occur, if Madeline even does make it to the summit of Mount Celeste, or if Senua does actually travel through Helheim, that maybe all of these journeys are through the mindscapes of both of our characters, that maybe the mountain doesn't actually exist. But all of these discussions would still lead us back, would still draw us back to the conversation of mental health. They would still come back to how Senua transforms from a woman of doubt and fear to resilience and perseverance, and how Madeline changes from one of having misunderstanding and arrogance to wisdom and sincerity. Our heroes learn about self-actualization, about truth and identity. It's why their journeys set them apart from Mass Effect, Spec Ops: The Line, and To the Moon. And it's why their journeys make them some of the most important games about the subject of mental health. Hellblade and Celeste are not ready to rely on issues of psychosis or depression as just unique characteristics, but rather they tackled the conversation of mental health head on. The games are honest with their attempts to spark a conversation, to try to make the player feel invested in the struggle, and to try to be more than just a video game.